Hello everyone. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about story. What we're talking about is you might have heard people refer to arcs in terms of both story arcs and character arcs. So what I thought I'd do with this video is that I would divide it in two. So this is going to be a look at how a story can arc and how a character can arc, because often the two will sort of go over each other. But this is, a basic introduction. So this is going to be quite a simplified version of these things, and I will put a little note at the end just to kind of say, there's a couple of books that you can look up that can help with this and kind of go into a bit more detail. That's the introduction of what we're going to be talking about today, and the idea is, in effect, to get thinking about, if you've got an idea for a story, where do you want it to go? What is the thing you want to produce? Because sometimes I think people can get kind of worried about something, or they'll start to create something and then not be 100% sure what they want to do with it. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so at this point we are now going to talk about what I would call is the story arc. Now, of course, this is not to say that story is more important than character or character is more important than story. Both are very important elements, but I am going to talk about what you can do to make your story as satisfying as possible. Now, it's quite interesting. There are always kind of talks about, the amount of stories that are out there. So there's a theory that there's only 7 plots in the world is one. Actually, my writing tutor simplified it even more, suggesting that there are, in effect, 2 stories. 1, a stranger comes to town. 2, a hero goes on a journey. And if you think about it, almost everything can come under those 2 things. It's incredibly simplified. Broadly speaking, I think if you think about it, a story can fit into one of those categories. But that's a good start. That's a good start of kind of narrowing down what your focus is. And also a good thing to think about is the expectations of what people have when you set up your story. Because that is something that I think it's important to be aware of, and it's important to know how to sort of... It's quite tricky because you want to sort of give people something different whilst at the same time kind of pushing the buttons of what they want. So, for example, the Western is a great example of a genre that changed over time, that started off a certain way, and then you had all these kind of different types of stories. So, if you look at something like, say, Shane, which is an absolute classic, it is in effect a story of a stranger comes to town, changes the people around him, and then leaves, because in effect he doesn't, even though he's kind of helped rescue the town, he doesn't really have that connection. And it's a sweet story. It's a very sweet, and it's a very kind of clear structure. In effect, person comes to town. Some people in the town initially don't trust him. Boy is fixated on him. There's kind of an unrequited crush by the mother. He stands up to this sort of bandit character played by Jack Palance, and eventually, like I say, with him sort of being this kind of figure from the wilderness, we don't really know where he came from, but he goes, and famously the child cries out Shane, sort of calls out as he goes off. Like I said, with some people debating whether or not he's dead at that point. But the point is, that is quite a clear, quite simplified beginning, middle and end story. There are sort of different versions of this. So High Noon, for example, also a Western, but it was also done as a kind of subtext and comment on society, in that the lead character, the sheriff character played by Gary Cooper, and absolute icon, but in it the story's kind of subverted, where he's calling out for help and the people that are supposed to help him don't. And in effect, the people who, sort of, as I say, do what they don't. But there's an added element of this where, not quite in real time, but there's a gang that's coming after this particular sheriff. So good. And then the ending, in effect, the ending of High Noon is like Die Hard. I know this is going to sound weird, but like when you watch it, and the reason I can say this is if you watch Die Hard, they openly refer to High Noon several times in the film because they know it's a strong influence. And there is nothing, and that's the other thing I want to say. And it's an incredibly lazy thing people put sometimes. Oh, such and such is a rip-off of such and such. It's like you can do that with a lot of things, and you've got to be very careful how you throw that about. One, justify your point. Two, it doesn't necessarily matter if the story is good. If the story is engaging, the fact that there are hokey bits, the fact that there are things that you can recognise from other things, if you're along for the ride, it doesn't matter. That is my personal opinion. Now, other people may disagree, and that's cool. But, you know, the fact is, if it's strong enough, it can override a lot of problems. And of course, but the idea is, to just like I say, I'm just saying there are certain expectations with the story. So like I say, both High Noon and Shane are westerns, but they are very different westerns. And then you've got something like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which is kind of a knockabout comedy, but done with a western. But again, with the beginning, middle, and end, and all the action and everything you expect. But it also has this wonderful charm in that you've got what was in effect. I mean, I'm sure there are other examples people can think of, but it's definitely a strong influence on the whole buddy cop, buddy action, whatever, of two, you know, sort of different people kind of playing off each other. And Paul Newman and Robert Redford, you know, even if they're not the first, they are definitely one of the strongest, and it's just so charming, and I love it. And then, of course, like I say, on the other end, you've got The Wild Bunch, which was directed by Sam Peckinpah. That came out around about the time of Vietnam, and it's basically about kind of the end of the Western era and the coming of the automobile and the Gatling gun, and these people who sort of see themselves as kind of, you know, not a great bunch of people, pun not intended, but you see where they go, and again, it is this kind of ultimately quite tragic thing of the one last stand, but it feels more senseless, and you know, the film starts with, and again, this is where story writing can be very clever. It starts off with these kids playing around, teasing a scorpion. And it's so clever because, again, it highlights, you know, this is the absurdity of existence. This is, you know, the whole line from, yeah, it is King Lear, you know, wanton flies to the gods are we. And it's so well done. But like you say, all of these are the same genre. They are all different films. I think they're all fantastic, but they're really different. And this is the point. Just because something is of a certain genre and people have certain expectations, you can still play with those expectations. And if you're smart, you can do it in a really clever way. Another recent example, Captain Marvel. Now, this one is a meta playing with expectation. I probably should have prefaced this. I think I might just like put a little like sign or something at the start of this, because inevitably, if I'm talking about plots of films, there's going to be spoilers. So for the recent one, and okay, admittedly this is a much more recent example of one what I've just mentioned, with Captain Marvel. So everyone saw the trailers, they saw the scrolls, and they were like, yeah, it's, you know, those guys are the bad guys, this is setting up X, Y, and Z. But Kevin Feige, being a very smart producer, and obviously you having very smart directors, very smart writers, they flip it on its head. And in actual fact, the Skrulls are not the bad guys. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Now, of course, that does now lead to people sort of discussing, like, well, what if X, Y, and Z? What if it leads to other things? So the discussion doesn't stop. There is still this feeling of, well, could this lead to something else somewhere else? And it is a very clever move. It is a very clever move. And like I say, the gambit of playing with expectations doesn't always come off. So, like I say, one of my personal ones that I didn't like was Iron Man 3. I'm sorry, the Mandarin reveal. I mean, I love Sir Ben Kingsley. I think he's a fantastic actor. I adore the original Iron Man. I think it's a terrific film, and like, not just for a Marvel film, I just think it's a terrific film, full stop. But Iron Man 3, it's like, really, like, you've undercut an iconic character. And I get it to an extent. It's a difficult character to put on screen. and because like I say, you want to avoid certain tropes with the character, and there is always that sort of feeling of where the character came from, and it's potentially very dated, which is the polite way of putting it. But it was a rug pull that didn't really work. And what I subsequently found out was that this wasn't going to be the original twist, and that there was actually going to be. I think Myra, who was the scientist character in it, was originally going to be the villain, but that was nixed because they felt that her action figure wouldn't sell. And that's kind of depressing, to be quite honest with you. That, that is such an odd thing for a priority, because you kind of think that they'd be a bit smarter than that, but apparently not. Anyway, personal opinion, moving on. So, what we are basically sort of saying is, you have to look at what you're creating, and that what you produce kind of gives people what they want, but if you can find the twist, if you can find the way to kind of enrich what you're doing, to kind of give it a bit extra, that's magic. That is wonderful, and that is what you've got to think about with your story. And there are various ways that you do this. So another phrase that's often used is what they call Chekhov's gun. So this goes back to this stage play idea, and effectively the rule was, if you saw a gun in the background, that gun had to be fired. Like, set-up, payoff. If you think about it in terms of comedy, punchline. You have the setup, then the punchline. That's how jokes often work. Obviously there's more complexity than that, but we're keeping it simple for now. So what you've got to think of is, what are you setting up in your story, and how do you pay it off? Because that can be on, the way to a happy ending, it can be a way to a tragic ending, it can be a way to an ambivalent ending. It doesn't necessarily have to go with the way people think, but it shouldn't be you're changing it for the sake of changing it. There should be a feeling of, what I'm watching, there was inevitability towards the thing, and that the rules I've set up feel consistent. Because this is something that people pick up, because audiences are sophisticated. They are, people at this point have seen a lot of films, they have consumed a lot of media. There are videos out there that can tell you about everything, that, at the click of a button, you can learn about everything from, Nosferatu to, a failed TV pilot for, the new Stooges films, or the new Monsters, etc. I mean, and it's awesome. It's awesome that these things exist, and that people have easy access to them. That's absolutely tremendous. But what it does mean is that as a writer, you have more of a challenge now, because people know what's coming. And of course, the other temptation with that is to go meta and to sort of go like, oh, that's a bit convenient. Oh, look how stupid that is. And don't get me wrong, a bit of that is funny. If you're doing a spoof, that can be funny. But even if you're not doing a parody, like, a bit of gentle ribbing is okay. So again, going back to the MCU, it was in Ant-Man and the Wasp, and Paul Rudd, because Paul Rudd is awesome, comes up with this line where he's just like, oh, so we're wearing dark glasses and caps, and that somehow disguises us. And it's like, it was funny because it wasn't a direct, like, full break, but it was enough so that the audience would be in on the joke, but it also kind of worked in the reality as well. Like, it wasn't completely out of nowhere. It made sense. It made sense with the character saying it, and made sense with the whole sort of world around it. Now, whether this was a written line or not, doesn't matter. It fitted the tone. Because the thing is, even if an actor is improving, the chances are they'll have seen a script or an outline or something before that, so you can write the framework for that character, so that actor to work around. So even if they do improvise, it is still part of that world, if you like. It's very rare that you'll get an improv that sort of comes from nowhere. So anywho, that I think kind of covers it. I mean, people often talk about what they call the 3-act structure. So, beginning, middle and end. And then Jean-Luc Godard, sort of famously said, yeah, but not necessarily in that order. So yeah, if you look at something like, say, Memento, Pulp Fiction, even something like the original Marvel Daredevil film, people play around with story structure all the time, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. What I will say is, if you are going to do that, because I've had this with experience, be careful how you use it. I'm not one of those people that say you can't use voiceover, or you can't use flashback, or you can't use dream sequences. No. Those are all tools. Those tools are all available to you. I would argue it is how you use them, because if they're used in a hackneyed way, they will annoy an audience. If they're used in a smart way, and you give people just enough information that they need, awesome. And that, as I say, will feed into the overall structure of what you want to do. And of course, on a wider level, once you've set this up as one film, think about what you want to do for a trilogy of films. Think about what you want to do for a TV series. Think about what you want to do for whatever genre you're doing. It helps to have an overall arc. Now, of course, you do have to be careful about that. You do still want to tell the story that you're telling, because, again, people can pick up on sequel bait. They're smart now. But if you have a story that has a satisfied beginning, middle, and end, but if you want to, you can leave enough more to make them hungry for more, that's awesome. If, however, you have a story with a very definite end, that should feel like whatever the ending is, it should make people feel satisfied going out from it. If that means the thing itself was what they wanted, or they're thirsty for more. Either way, awesome. Okay, so now we've spoken about story arc. Now I want to talk about something that you'll hear a lot of people saying, and chances are if you ever work with an actor, they're going to ask about this. Because there are, because people talk about, they make jokes about, oh, what's my motivation, or, what is my character's arc. But this is an important thing, because these things are tied together. So, motivation. What does the character want? And it doesn't matter how big the part is, whether you're the bumbling henchman, or the hero, or the villain. Everyone wants something. What you have to come up with is, in effect, what is the thing they want? Is it really what they want? What's the sort of underlying thing? Because again, it depends how far sophisticated you want to go with the character. And, sort of, what are they prepared to do to get it? And motivation is a big part of that, because sometimes, like I said, the thing initially what you think it is, so there's this term called the MacGuffin, which is an essentially unimportant item, but it drives a plot home. That comes into it quite a lot. But in effect, if people are searching for something, it's not always the case, in fact very often it's not the case, that the thing they're looking for is the main thrust. So for example, let's talk about Treasure Island. So Treasure Island, maybe this isn't all adaptations, but it seems to come up a fair amount, where Jim Hawkins, it's not just that he's after the treasure, it's, he's missing his dad, he's missing a father figure, and in effect Long John Silver kind of fills that role a bit. But then subsequently Hawkins realises that, Long John Silver's a pirate, he's not actually, the father figure he was hoping for. And in effect there's a level of sort of acceptance and maturity, and it's as much the emotional journey as it is the treasure. And okay, that is cheesy as heck, but it's also true, isn't it? And if you think about it, this is true of a lot of stories. So again, we mentioned Iron Man earlier. I mean, Iron Man I think is a very good example of that, because there's, throughout the MCU films, there's been a few kind of arcs that he's had, and he's kind of played different roles within different stories. So in the case of the original Iron Man, it was very much a case of I think Jon Favreau did mention Christmas Carol, but there was definitely a case of a conversion. This was someone who believed in what he was doing, that what he was doing was right, that what he was doing was, in effect, the American way. And then, after he gets captured by the terrorists and he realises that his weapons have been sold to people that shouldn't have had them in the first place, there is that conversion, that realisation that actually what he's doing was the exact opposite of what he thought, and he sort of dedicates himself to changing it. And the brilliant thing of the character arc in this story is the essential essence of Tony Stark doesn't change in that story. he's still a bit sarcastic, he's still very arrogant, but there's the realisation of doing things better. There is that sense of him being a scientist. And what I like in the story, it's not a case of he makes a thing, thing does thing. It's a case of trial and error, making it better, and eventually, which is quite a cute twist at the end, the way he defeats the villain is that he thought of a detail that the villain didn't. Which is brilliant if you think about it. And of course, like I say, in subsequent films, the role that he takes changes. So in the case of Avengers, he's kind of butting heads with Captain America, and it's that sense of him sort of trying to establish himself as sort of the alpha dog in a team that very much reveres Captain America, and understandably so. And so there's always that bit of tension there where he's kind of proving himself. And again, similar to Batman in a way, like a person who doesn't have powers, but who wants to prove himself. And again, we'll come back to that as well. Again, reminder, possible spoilers, blah blah blah. So, you know, we then get to Civil War, and this is then flipped around where Tony Stark becomes an antagonist. And the reason he becomes an antagonist is interesting because it is valid. It is about him sort of in effect saying, well, we'd better follow the rules before they're enforced on us, which fair play has happened with businesses throughout history. It's not a new thing. But Captain America kind of arguing, well, no, because who then gets to decide? And it's interesting because there is kind of sympathy on both sides. It's very well done. And considering the amount of characters they have to juggle in that time, I think it's very well done. Now, my personal criticism is I'm not a big fan of the villain, which is a shame because I absolutely love Daniel Bruhl. And if you haven't seen Goodbye Lenin, you should, but that's a side issue. Now, in this instance, what happens is that Tony Stark, you know, at first he's very brutal, he's very much about, this is the way we've got to do it, this is where it's got to be, and then it goes into a darker sort of tragic shift when the truth about the Winter Soldier and his parents and everything is revealed, and he realises that Captain America knew, and it was a cover-up, and it's brutal and personal and horrible, but then there is the ending, there is a little bit of reconciliation, and there is that hope towards the end. And then we also have, with Spider-Man Homecoming, we then have Tony Stark the Mentor, which is very interesting because, of course, we know, because we've had this arc throughout the whole MCU, that he is not the best person to be an example. He is someone who is, you know, very flawed. He is, you know, he has an opinion of how things have to be, but of course he is sort of, in effect, doing it in the right way to try and make sure that Peter develops as he wants him to. Now, of course, there's some debate as to whether or not this is effective in terms of the Spider-Man story, but we'll move on. And of course, we then have the ultimate moment to kind of redeem the characters. So with Endgame, we have a wonderful sort of personal moment where Tony Stark gets to talk to his father and realising sort of where he's come from, which is a lovely moment where he kind of, in effect, sort of finds peace with himself in that way, which is wonderful, and I love that. But then you then have the ultimate thing. So again, talking about the Chekhov's gun thing, if you remember, we were talking about that earlier. So Captain America sort of said, like, you're not the kind of person to make the sacrifice play, but who makes the ultimate sacrifice play? Iron Man does. And in the line, I am Iron Man, it's the last thing he said at the end of his film, and it all ties up perfectly. It ties up a character's arc across 10 years worth of films. Now, am I saying that the MCU is perfect? No. There are a lot of things that we could break down and sort of talk about, but we're not going to talk about that now. But in terms of showing a character in different roles, showing a character progress, showing a character learn, screw up, develop, regress in some situations and then come back in others to the ultimate redemptive point, wonderful. And this is what I think you have to remember when you think about your character. Now, your character does not necessarily have to be a superhero. Your character does not have to go on a grand journey. It can be personal as well. if it's a story about someone, studying for an exam and they have to deal with the fact that they're not the best at studying and they're trying to learn the methods to help them learn, that in and of itself can be a great story. That that personal level can work, because again, you can have that arc of someone starting from one point and getting to the point where hopefully they achieve what they want. And that, because if you think about the it's basically a subgenre now, the underdog sports story, where a team starts off as no hopers but ends up winning a championship, and we love those kinds of stories. And why? Because it's so it makes us sort of feel like these things are possible, and and it's that belief in the spirit. Rocky, and again, Rocky has that great line where he talks about it's not about how many times you get hit, it's about how many times you can get back up after you've been hit. And I think that is a great kind of metaphor for life, and great characters can do that for you. Great characters, I don't necessarily want to say role models, but because equally you can empathise with a character that's absolutely awful and terrible. So like Hannibal Lecter, for example, absolutely horrific. The guy is a murderer, a cannibal, a psychopath. But he's also charming, he is also interesting, he is also intelligent. And it's that conflict, and this is obviously, I would say, most effective in, I haven't seen Hannibal the TV show, but I would say in terms of the films, I would say the incredible thing with the original Silence of the Lambs, because it's easy to forget that you only see him for about 20 minutes in the film, but there is just something about that performance. It's magnetic, but but it's in the writing as well. It's there. It's this character who, in effect, is drawing the audience in almost as much as Clarice Starling, and it's so well done. And it is just a clever thing. And like I said, sometimes, even if a character isn't sympathetic, if they're well done and they engage with people, that's great. And like I say, every character can potentially go on an arc. Okay, I can name off a few ones that you've probably seen coming a lot. So, for example, the bumbling sidekick to the villain who goes on to realise the villain is wrong and redeems himself at the end by helping the heroes. You've probably seen that lots of times. There's an example, or, like I say, someone who sort of starts off as a cynic and then realises the thing that they were cynical about is true, or someone who another one, like the dad who says I don't like you doing that performance thing, and then right at the end they're there supporting them. There's lots of cheesy stuff like that. But again, depending on how well you do it, depending on what you do with the building blocks, you can make that work. And then if a character is rich and compelling enough, even if, I think this is the thing, I know I spoke before about how you need story and character, and I wouldn't say one is more important than the other, but what I will say is the advantage of an engaging character is that an engaging character can often sort of, if there's a plot hole, or if there's sort of something that doesn't quite make sense, if you like the journey you're going on with the character, and if it's going well, and if you like being with them, the odds are you won't think about it as much. That's what I will say. That's where arguably character has the edge over story, because an engaging story works as long as you are going along with it. And I don't want to exaggerate it too much, because I do think sometimes people go overboard with the nitpicks, and I think it's very difficult. Here's a rule especially: time travel. Don't get too hung up on time travel and plot holes in that, because it's, by its nature, it's not going to be perfect, because if in effect they win in the end, none of the events technically happen, well, you don't have a film. So a little bit of slack, I think. So yeah, that is, like I said, this is kind of a broad introduction. I think we've covered quite a lot using relatively sort of simple examples, but the main thing I would say with any story that you're writing, so like I say, thinking about the main events that you're kind of got in the story and how they work and how you're getting from each point, but equally think about who you're writing for, who these characters are, think about stories you've seen that kind of engage with it. Don't necessarily look at the genre that you're doing it in and sort of look at those examples, because you want it done right. So look at stories and think, how do they do this right? And to be fair, even with bad films, if you see the film and you think, oh god, I don't like what they're doing with that, what is it you don't like? Because that will also help you as much as looking at a good thing and going, what are the things I do like? Because ideally you want a bit of both. But yeah, I think that kind of covers everything. Finally, issue 2 is still out, so we would love it if you could download a copy for us or get a print version. We've got lots of links, which I'm going to do a little pick at the end. Please support us, because then we can keep doing the comic. And if you've got any questions regarding creative projects, then please let us know, because we can always set up future videos. It's been a delight talking to you. Much love. Bye.